Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are looking at a story that, honestly, genuinely defies belief. We're talking about a single, working-class woman who miraculously lived through not one, not two, but three of history's most famous ship disasters. Her name was Violet Jessop, and by the end of this explainer, you're going to understand exactly why history remembers her as Miss Unsinkable. Okay, let's dive into this, because mathematically speaking, the odds of being on board three distinct, catastrophic maritime disasters and actually walking away to tell the tale, they are staggeringly low. Practically zero. But this isn't just a story of incredibly bad luck. It's a thriller-like saga of resilience, duty, and just sheer human endurance. To really understand how Violet found herself at the center of these historical focal points, well, we have to look at where she started. Section 1. A Life at Sea. Escaping Poverty on the Floating Palaces. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the sheer concentration of history in just a tiny 5-year span. This timeline is our roadmap for today. Violet was employed on all three of the White Star Line's massive, luxurious Olympic-class sister ships. She sailed on the Olympic in 1911, the Titanic in 1912, and the Britannic in 1916. Three identically massive ships, three utterly shocking disasters. So who was she? Well, Violet Jessop was born in 1887 in Argentina to Irish immigrants. And from the very beginning, she was a survivor. She actually beat a childhood bout of tuberculosis that doctors literally said would kill her. After her father passed away, Violet went to sea to support her family, joining the White Star Line in 1910. Actually, she was pretty hesitant at first. She really didn't like the idea of sailing the North Atlantic run because, the notoriously harsh weather and the demanding passengers. And the job itself, it was brutal. We're talking 17-hour days serving wealthy travelers, all for a really meager base pay. But she was drawn by the tips, the ability to be the main breadwinner for her siblings, and quite frankly, the fierce independence that life at sea offered a young woman in the Edwardian era. That brings us right to strike one, the RMS Olympic collision in 1911. At the time, the Olympic was the absolute largest civilian liner in the world. It was the pride and joy of the White Star Line, and Violet was perfectly happy working aboard it. But then, on September 20, 1911, disaster strikes. While navigating through the Solent, the Olympic was suddenly rammed by a British warship, the cruiser HMS Hawke. Now keep in mind, the Hawke had a bow specifically designed to sink other ships by ramming them. It tore two massive holes right into the Olympic's hull, piercing it both above and below the waterline. It twisted the propeller shaft, flooded two watertight compartments. It was a mess. Yet miraculously, Violet and the rest of the crew survived totally unharmed, as the massive ship managed to somehow limp back to port. This incident, terrifying as it absolutely was, kind of lulled Violet into a false sense of security. To her, it seemed to prove that these giant ships truly were unsinkable. Which leads us directly into Strike 2, surviving the RMS Titanic in 1912. Here's the crazy part. Violet actually didn't want to transfer to the Titanic. She was perfectly content staying on the repaired Olympic. But her friends persuaded her, insisting it would be this wonderful experience to serve on the brand new ship's maiden voyage. So she joins the best-of-class crew under Captain Edward Smith, who, by the way, was the exact same captain at the helm during the Olympic collision. We all know what happened on the night of April 14th when the Titanic struck that iceberg. But Violet's perspective? It's fascinating. As a stewardess, her main duty during a disaster was to prevent panic. So she was ordered up on deck to basically function as a living, breathing example. She just stood at the bulkhead, wearing her life belt, modeling absolutely calm behavior so that non-English-speaking immigrants would understand what to do and follow her lead. Just imagine the immense, unbelievable courage required to stand perfectly still and look unbothered while the largest ship in the world is literally sinking beneath your feet. The tension on that deck must have been absolutely unimaginable. As the lifeboats were finally being lowered into the water, an officer suddenly turns to Violet. According to her own memoirs, he just said, "Here, Miss Jessop, look after this baby," and abruptly dropped a bundled infant right into her lap before she was ordered into a lifeboat. The whole point was to prove to the other terrified women that it was safe to get in. That boat was Lifeboat 16, and from that tiny wooden boat in the freezing dark, Violet sat and watched the magnificent Titanic plunge into the depths. She held on to that baby through the freezing night until the rescue ship Carpathia finally arrived the next morning. And then, in this bizarre, almost cinematic twist, while she was sitting exhausted on the deck of the Carpathia, a woman,
who we can only presume was the terrified mother, runs up, silently snatches the baby directly from Violet's arms, and just vanishes into the crowd. Not a single word spoken.
And that brings us to Strike 3, the HMS Britannic mine disaster in 1916. Now, you would think that would be enough sea travel for one lifetime, right? But by now, World War I has broken out. Violet has shifted from being a civilian stewardess serving wealthy elites to serving as a British Red Cross nurse caring for wounded soldiers. She gets assigned to the Titanic's younger sister ship, the Britannic, which had been fully converted into a massive hospital ship. And this brilliantly illustrates the staggering contrast between her two sinkings. On the Titanic, despite the immense tragedy of it all, the initial evacuation was somewhat orderly, it was quiet, and it was freezing cold. The Britannic disaster? It was the exact opposite. Sailing in the warm Aegean Sea, the ship struck an underwater naval mine. The sinking was incredibly fast and just violently chaotic. The ship's massive propellers were literally lifted right out of the water while they were still spinning at full speed. Violet's eyewitness account of this is pure, unadulterated horror. She was loaded into Lifeboat 2, but the massive suction from the sinking ship pulled her lifeboat directly toward those exposed spinning blades. She later wrote that she saw the Britannic's huge propellers churning and mincing up everything near them, men, boats, and everything was just one ghastly whirl. Faced with certain death if she stayed on the lifeboat, Violet was forced to leap into the churning water. As she was sucked under, she violently struck her head on the ship's keel. Somehow, she survived and was pulled into another boat, but she credited her extremely thick auburn hair for cushioning that devastating blow. And astonishingly, you can't make this up, it wasn't until years later when she went to a doctor complaining of continuous headaches that she discovered she had actually sustained a fractured skull that day in the water.
Section 4. The Resolution. 42 years resilient.
After surviving a massive collision, the most infamous iceberg in human history, and a naval mine explosion that literally fractured her skull, you'd assume Violet Jessop ran as far inland as physically possible, right? Never to look at a boat again. But she didn't. So the crucial point is 42 years. 42 years. That is the total number of years Violet Jessop spent working at sea. She allowed her fractured skull to heal, she waited for the World War to end, and then she packed her bags and walked right back up the gangway of another ocean liner. Her level of dedication is almost beyond comprehension. She returned to the White Star Line, even sailing again on the old reliable RMS Olympic. Later on, she joined the Red Star Line, enjoying these incredibly glamorous world cruises. She worked right up until the outbreak of World War II, and then she signed on again after the war for a final stint. She finally retired in 1950 at the age of 61, settling down in Suffolk, England, where she basically filled her quiet home with mementos of her incredible, death-defying career. She had truly, undeniably earned the nickname Miss Unsinkable. Which leaves us with one final thought. We've seen her incredible courage, her absolute duty to her family, and her completely unbreakable spirit. But I have to ask you, after surviving 3 of the most terrifying shipwrecks of the 20th century, would you ever set foot on a ship again? Because Violet Jessop did, over and over again. Thank you so much for joining me on The Explainer to uncover this absolute triumph of the human spirit. Until next time, keep learning and stay curious.